David Walker was a free black man and radical abolitionist who became one of the most influential voices against slavery in American history. David Walker, author of The Revolutionary Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, was born free in Wilmington, North Carolina on September 28, 1796. He came from a mother who was free, and under the laws of the time, this meant David was born free despite his father being enslaved. He witnessed the brutal realities of slavery from his earliest days. Walker's experiences in the South were formative. He was educated, which was rare for black Americans at that time, whether free or enslaved. The young Walker traveled extensively throughout the South, and everywhere he went he saw the horrors of the slave system. He saw families torn apart, people beaten and degraded, human beings treated as property. These experiences burned into his consciousness and shaped his mission for the rest of his life. In the early 1820s, David Walker made a momentous decision. He could no longer bear to live in the South where slavery surrounded him. He left North Carolina and traveled north, eventually settling in Boston, Massachusetts in 1825. Boston was a center of free black life and abolitionist activity. Walker found a community there, but he never forgot what he had witnessed in the South. In Boston, Walker established himself as a used clothing dealer. He opened a shop on Brattle Street near the waterfront. This location was strategic, whether intentionally or not, because the waterfront brought Walker into contact with black sailors who traveled up and down the Atlantic coast. These sailors would become crucial to distributing his message. Walker quickly became active in Boston's black community. He was a man of deep religious conviction and intellectual curiosity. He joined the Methodist Church and became involved in various organizations dedicated to the welfare and advancement of black Americans. Walker was a member of the Massachusetts General Colored Association, one of the first organizations in the nation dedicated to the abolition of slavery and the advancement of black rights. He was not content to simply live his own life in freedom while millions remained in bondage. Walker became a subscription agent for Freedom's Journal, the first black-owned and operated newspaper in the United States. Through this work, he stayed connected to the broader struggle for black liberation and kept his finger on the pulse of abolitionist thought. But David Walker was not satisfied with the cautious, gradualist approach that characterized much of the abolitionist movement in the 1820s. Many white abolitionists at the time favored colonization, the idea of sending black Americans back to Africa rather than integrating them as equal citizens. Even some black leaders supported this approach, seeing no hope for true equality in America. Walker rejected colonization utterly. He believed that black Americans had as much right to this country as anyone else. They had built it with their labor, watered its soil with their blood and tears. America was their home, and they deserved full citizenship and equality. Walker also grew frustrated with the moderate tone of the abolitionist movement. He believed that slavery was not just a moral wrong that could be gradually reformed away. It was a monstrous evil that demanded immediate action. He saw slavery as a system of violence, and he began to believe that violence might be necessary to end it. These were dangerous ideas in 1820s America. Even in the North, even in Boston, speaking openly about slave resistance and rebellion could bring severe consequences. But David Walker was not a man to be silenced by fear. In 1829, David Walker published his masterwork, a pamphlet that would shake the nation to its core. He called it Walker's Appeal, in 4 articles, together with a preamble, to the colored citizens of the world, but in particular, and very expressly, to those of the United States of America. It is commonly known simply as Walker's Appeal. This document was unlike anything that had come before in American abolitionist literature. It was not a polite petition to white Americans' better angels. It was not a patient argument for gradual emancipation. Walker's Appeal was a fiery, prophetic denunciation of slavery and a call to action for enslaved and free black Americans alike. Walker's Appeal was divided into 4 articles, each addressing a different aspect of the condition of black Americans. The first article dealt with slavery itself, calling it the most degrading and inhuman system ever devised. Walker compared American slavery unfavorably even to ancient systems of bondage, arguing that American slavery was uniquely cruel in its total dehumanization of its victims. The second article attacked ignorance and education, arguing that slaveholders deliberately kept black people ignorant to maintain control, and calling on black Americans to educate themselves and their children. The third article focused on religion, condemning the hypocrisy of Christian slaveholders and calling out white ministers who used the Bible to justify slavery. The fourth article addressed colonization, that plan supported by many whites and some blacks to send free black Americans to Africa, and Walker denounced it as a scheme to remove free blacks who might inspire the enslaved to resist. Throughout the appeal, Walker's language was biblical and prophetic. He invoked God's judgment on America for the sin of slavery. He warned that divine retribution was coming if the nation did not repent and abolish slavery immediately. But Walker did not only call on God to act. He also called on black Americans themselves to resist their oppression by any means necessary. This was the most controversial and dangerous aspect of Walker's appeal. He explicitly told enslaved people that they had the right to kill their masters if that was what it took to gain their freedom. He wrote that it was better to die fighting for freedom than to live in degradation as slaves. He called on black Americans to rise up, to refuse to submit, to claim their humanity and their rights. Walker was careful to say that he preferred peaceful means if possible. He was not bloodthirsty or violent by nature. But he was realistic about the nature of slavery. It was a system maintained by violence, and he believed that violence might be necessary to overthrow it. He asked white Americans to consider what they would do if they were enslaved. Would they not fight for their freedom? Why then should black Americans be expected to submit passively? Walker's appeal was a radical document that challenged not just slavery but the entire racial hierarchy of American society. He insisted on the full humanity and equality of black people. He rejected any notion of black inferiority. He argued that if black Americans seemed degraded, it was only because of the oppression they suffered, not because of any innate deficiency. The publication of Walker's appeal sent shockwaves through the nation. Walker used his connections with black sailors to distribute the pamphlet throughout the South. Copies were sewn into the linings of coats that sailors wore into southern ports. The pamphlet was smuggled into cities like Charleston, Savannah, Richmond, and New Orleans. When copies were discovered, Southern authorities reacted with panic and fury. This was exactly what they feared most, a call for slave rebellion coming from a free black man in the North. Southern states passed new laws restricting the movement of free blacks and the distribution of abolitionist literature. In some places, it became a crime even to possess a copy of Walker's appeal. Authorities in the South put a price on Walker's head. According to some accounts, a reward of $3,000 was offered for Walker dead, and $10,000 for Walker alive. These were enormous sums at the time, equivalent to hundreds of thousands of dollars today. Southern authorities wanted Walker silenced, and they wanted to make an example of him. In the North, reaction was mixed. Some white abolitionists were horrified by Walker's militant language. They feared it would set back the cause of abolition by provoking a violent backlash. They preferred moral persuasion and gradual change. William Lloyd Garrison, who would become the most famous white abolitionist, had not yet begun publishing his newspaper The Liberator when Walker's appeal appeared. But when Garrison did begin his work in 1831, he rejected Walker's call for violence while embracing his demand for immediate abolition. Other abolitionists, both black and white, were inspired by Walker's courage and his uncompromising stance. They saw that he was willing to speak truths that others were afraid to utter. David Walker was undeterred by the threats against him. Friends urged him to flee to Canada for his safety, but Walker refused. He said that someone had to be willing to take a stand, even at the cost of their own life. He revised and republished the appeal, releasing a second edition and then a third, each more forceful than the last. He continued his work in Boston, continuing to operate his shop, continuing to be active in the black community, continuing to spread his message. Walker knew he was in danger, but he would not be silenced. He believed his cause was righteous and that God was on his side. He was willing to become a martyr if that was what it took to advance the cause of freedom. On June 28, 1830, David Walker married a young woman named Eliza. It seemed that despite the danger surrounding him, Walker was looking toward the future, building a life. But that future would be tragically short. Just over a month later, on August 6, 1830, David Walker was found dead near the doorway of his shop on Brattle Street. He was only 33 years old. The official cause of death was listed as consumption, what we now call tuberculosis. But many people, then and now, have suspected that Walker was murdered. The timing was too convenient. A man with a price on his head, a man who had defied the most powerful interests in the nation, suddenly dies of natural causes at a young age? Many in Boston's black community believed that Walker had been poisoned by Southern agents. No proof was ever found, and the truth of how David Walker died remains a mystery to this day. What is not a mystery is the impact of David Walker's life and work. Walker's appeal became one of the most important documents in the history of American abolitionism. It represented a turning point, a moment when the abolitionist movement began to embrace more radical demands and tactics. Walker's insistence on immediate abolition, his rejection of colonization, his assertion of black equality, these positions would become central to the abolitionist movement in the 1830s and beyond. William Lloyd Garrison founded the Liberator newspaper in January 1831, just months after Walker's death, and Garrison's motto was immediate and complete emancipation. This was Walker's position. Frederick Douglass, the great black abolitionist and orator, would later acknowledge the influence of Walker's appeal on his own thinking. Walker's appeal also had a more immediate and dramatic impact. In August 1831, exactly 1 year after Walker's death, a slave named Nat Turner led the most significant slave rebellion in American history in Southampton County, Virginia. Turner and his followers killed nearly 60 white people before the rebellion was suppressed. Whether Turner had read Walker's appeal is uncertain, but the timing led many to draw a connection. Southern authorities certainly believed that documents like Walker's appeal inspired rebellions like Turner's. This led to even harsher restrictions on black literacy and movement throughout the South. David Walker's legacy extends beyond his immediate impact on the abolitionist movement. He represents a tradition of black radicalism and resistance that runs throughout American history. Walker refused to accept the gradualism and compromise that characterized much of the early abolitionist movement. He insisted that the enslaved had the right to fight for their freedom, that they were not obligated to wait patiently for white Americans to grant them their rights. He asserted black humanity and equality in the strongest possible terms, refusing to accept any notion of black inferiority. Walker also demonstrated the power of the written word as a weapon against oppression. His appeal was a text, a pamphlet, words on paper. But those words were so powerful, so dangerous to the slave system, that Southern authorities banned them and put a price on the author's head. Walker showed that ideas could be as threatening to an unjust system as guns or swords. In his personal life, Walker was known as a man of principle and courage. He was deeply religious, seeing his work as part of God's plan. He was educated and articulate, able to marshal powerful arguments against slavery and racism. He was also a man of action, not content to simply write and speak but working to distribute his message and build organizations. Walker was a community leader in Boston, respected and admired by those who knew him. He was a husband, though his marriage was tragically brief. He was a businessman, supporting himself through his own labor. He was all of these things, but above all, he was a freedom fighter, someone who dedicated his life to the liberation of his people. The question of violence in Walker's appeal remains controversial. Some see Walker as a prophet of justified resistance, arguing that enslaved people had every right to use violence to free themselves from a violent system. Others see his advocacy of violence as morally troubling, even while acknowledging the evil of slavery. This debate reflects broader questions about the role of violence in social change, questions that remain relevant today. What is clear is that Walker was not advocating violence for its own sake. He was responding to the violence of slavery itself, a system that was maintained through whipping, torture, rape, family separation, and murder. Walker was asking why enslaved people should be expected to submit to this violence without fighting back. Walker's rejection of colonization also deserves emphasis. The American Colonization Society, founded in 1816, promoted the idea of sending free black Americans to Africa, specifically to the colony of Liberia. Many prominent white Americans supported colonization, including some who opposed slavery. They believed that black and white Americans could never live together as equals, and that the solution was separation. Some free black Americans supported colonization as well, despairing of ever achieving equality in America. But Walker saw colonization for what it was, a way to remove free blacks who might inspire enslaved people to seek freedom, and a denial of black Americans' right to the country they had built. Walker insisted that America was as much the home of black Americans as white Americans, and that black Americans deserved full citizenship and equality right here. David Walker's appeal to the colored citizens of the world was reprinted and circulated for decades after his death. It influenced generations of black activists and thinkers. In the 20th century, scholars and activists rediscovered Walker's appeal and recognized its importance. Walker came to be seen as a forerunner of later black radical traditions, from Marcus Garvey to Malcolm X to the Black Power movement. His insistence on black pride, his rejection of white supremacy, his willingness to consider militant resistance, these themes would echo through black freedom struggles for generations. Walker's life was short, but his impact was profound and lasting. The city of Boston, where Walker lived and died, has recognized his significance. There is a memorial to David Walker on Beacon Hill, near where he lived and worked. The inscription honors him as a pioneering abolitionist and civil rights activist. But for many years, Walker was a forgotten figure, overshadowed by later abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. This forgetting was not accidental. Walker's radicalism made him a controversial figure, and there were those who preferred to remember the abolitionist movement as more moderate and less threatening than it actually was. Recovering Walker's story means acknowledging the full range of abolitionist thought and tactics, including the militant resistance that Walker advocated. When David Walker died in 1830, slavery still had more than 30 years to run in the United States. It would take a civil war, costing more than 600,000 lives, to finally end slavery. Walker did not live to see emancipation, did not live to see his prophecies of divine judgment on America for the sin of slavery come to pass in the form of that bloody war. But his words helped prepare the ground for that eventual reckoning. He was one of the voices crying out in the wilderness, warning that a nation built on slavery could not stand, that justice delayed would eventually demand a terrible price. In the end, David Walker was proven right, though the cost of that vindication was higher than anyone could have imagined. David Walker remains a challenging and inspiring figure. He challenges us to consider what we would be willing to sacrifice for justice, what risks we would take to fight oppression. He inspires us with his courage, his eloquence, his uncompromising commitment to freedom and equality. He lived only 33 years, but in that short life he made a mark on history that endures to this day. David Walker was a free black man who could have lived quietly, enjoying his own freedom while ignoring the plight of the enslaved. Instead, he chose to speak out, to take risks, to fight for the freedom of all his people. He paid for that choice with his life, but his words and his example lived on, inspiring others to continue the struggle. David Walker was, even in death, a voice for freedom that could not be silenced.